I'm Rob Downey, a family practice MD and Institute for Functional Medicine certified practitioner. I'm coming to you from Seaworthy Functional Medicine in Homer, Alaska. Seaworthy exists to help people overcome their health challenges and be fully vital. Fatigue. It feels like the bane of so many people's existence, and they curse it and gnash their teeth. It's the number one code in my practice. And we are so fortunate to be joined today by a gifted practitioner in this space who has devoted his career to helping people get vibrant energy all day, every day, Dr. Evan Hirsch. Dr. Evan, thanks for your time today.
Dr. Rob, thanks so much for having me on.
It's so nice when I get to work with someone I've interviewed before and spent time with. You were so gracious to create a place for me to land in the summit space a number of years ago. And so I'm forever indebted to you to opening up the digital ether to me and trusting me to be here. So it's a nice chance to get to share that. And now we fast forward, we're meeting again. If this were, I don't know, the Lord of the Rings movie, we'd be in the third movie, right? Where we've come through 5 years of the pandemic and all the characters are unrecognizable, some are scarred.
Right.
So,
Your journey.
so, and then your practice has evolved now too, in that you've got this long-standing program that's helped thousands of people. And we're going to talk today about your program to help people get their energy back. And now these same root causes that you've addressed for a long time, they're very salient to long COVID, which I do think that we should talk about today. Is that an accurate place to start?
Yeah, chronic fatigue syndrome has been my work for the last decade after I got it and got over it and went on a mission to help as many people as I could. And I'm uniquely positioned to help people with long COVID as well because the causes are all the same for the most part. The body has been kind of set up for a problem, and then the COVID becomes the straw that breaks the camel's back. So
Mhm.
there are some nuances with COVID that I'd love to get into, but the reality is that the toxic five is at work in both the chronic fatigue syndrome and long COVID.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm sure that our audience, who I thank for joining us, is going to be just super interested. And I do want to set the stage a little because one argument that could be made is that fatigue is the OG topic. And so the reason I say that, if you just look at the single code that drives the majority of my diagnostic testing that shows up in basically every one of my notes, it's fatigue. And when I talk to people, I say in functional medicine, the fatigue diagnosis itself, for me at least, hinges around whether they do or do not have perfect energy all day, every day. And then they groan and they roll their eyes and they say, of course I don't. And I point out that Tom Solt from the IFM faculty during the module that he teaches for certification, he'll say normal energy is perfect energy all day, every day. And the way I had the aha moment, he said, think about creatures in nature. Of course, they rest and they nap and that sort of thing. But he said, if you look at the natural world, they have the energy they need to do everything they need to do all day, every day. And that's sort of our birthright. And so I think that even fatigue is people's pain point, but the part they often haven't thought about is what's the other side of this? What is my birthright? What's normal? And normal is an incredible amount of energy.
Right.
So the fact that this is either part of people's constellation of signs and symptoms, or it's part of them getting better, we have to get their energy improved for whatever else they're working on to resolve. There is no more important topic in functional medicine. So again, I'm so thankful we get to talk to you today. Uh, you've evolved since the last time I talked to you. What's the best way to land on your work now? What do people need to know about what you would describe as normal energy, and where did it go? What happened?
Yeah, so if you were healthy as a teenager, then the energy that you had was, I mean, yes, it was a little bit hard getting out of bed because those high school classes are so damn early. But essentially, you woke up and you moved through your day. You weren't consuming caffeine for the most part. I mean, maybe you had some Mountain Dew every once in a while, but the reality is that you had good energy if you were healthy when you were a teen or even before that. Okay. And then what ends up happening is that there are stresses that happen in life and that accumulate. And so these can be mental and emotional stressors like trauma, or just by living in a home with birthed from two imperfect parents and living with siblings who are imperfect and being surrounded by kids who are all imperfect from imperfect parents as well, right? So that all becomes quite stressful to navigate all of that. And then there's the stressors of the toxins that build up over time. So the heavy metals, the chemicals, the molds, and the infections that end up all leading to nervous system dysfunction. So the toxic five that I referred to initially is that combination of heavy metals, chemicals, molds, infections, and nervous system dysfunction. And that is the recipe for chronic fatigue syndrome and for long COVID. So when you get enough of those, then you end up where the body basically calls it quits and says, hey, I need to relax. You get what's called the cell danger response, where the body says, hey, I need to recoup. And I'm just going to rest all the time right now because that's what I need in order to potentially get better. Right. And so the
Mm,
recipe for resolution is to remove the toxic five.
mm, mm. Awesome. Yeah, I want to sort of mirror this back to you and make sure we've got this right as we pass this inflection point to the next part. So we're taxed, but we don't know it. We're being taxed as we go. And we've got $30,000 in our energy bank account, and then 20, and then 10, and then 5, and then we're bouncing checks. And the related issue that I think is so important is that we be compassionate and realize the body's brilliant. The body knows the way. It's not quitting us. It's not betraying us. It's protecting core functions like breathing, recognizing the people who've got our backs.
Right.
And it's saying, hey, there's a problem here. The way it's saying it is saying, I'm trying to rest all the time and reboot, but I can't. I need you to do something. I need you, executive function, to do something for me I can't do for myself because I've been taxed out of existence and now you got to help me get back.
Well, it's saying, I don't care about your societal pressures. I don't care about your job. I don't care about all this stuff. I care about your physiology. I care about
Yeah.
survival. And
Yeah.
so then I need to rest. And so, yeah, I absolutely agree. We have to have compassion and that understanding that our body is trying to serve us. The reality is that it's not really working with what we want to do in our lives. And oftentimes, the goals that we have set and the relationships that we want to cultivate and the work that we want to do. And so, so you have to do something when you start to see things flagging. When you said kind of you start bouncing checks, right? You start realizing that you're napping, your energy's not what you want, you're consuming more caffeine, your energy is just not as good as it once was, and you're surviving and you're pushing through. Like you have to pay attention to that. Otherwise, you're going to crash and you're going to unfortunately end up bedbound, and then that's a real problem. So
Mhm.
yeah, I couldn't agree more. Well said.
Mm, very good. Well, let's do something a little different, at least in my podcast. And we talked about that as we prepared for today. One thing I always try to do is I know that my audience loves to get to look under the hood and know what thought leaders sort of the gritty things they've learned that we wouldn't know otherwise. So that'd be great to hear about today. And then the related thing is it's important. I love it that we're in a world now. You and I have talked about this before where people have options because when I was in high school and I cut my leg skiing in Western Montana, my option was the insensitive and uncaring local physician. And that's part of my trauma history. And just so the whole sort of default that there's just conventional and that's it. And a lot of gifted, nice family practice doctors in the world, just not the one I had when I grew up. And now we've got this disenchantment just where people say they know there's more going on, they know they need root cause medicine. And there's these really, really cool programs, including yours, that people can do. So now they've got agency, empowerment, and options. As we talk today, let's tie into this not only what people need to know to do, but why are there freestanding programs like yours, and what would it feel like to do the program? Because I think that's part of the mental pressure on them is what are my options? Is there going to be testing or not? Is this going to be group visits? Is this going to be online? Just sort of what's the structure?
Yeah, so let's dive in. I think what's important that I'm going to lay out is that this comes from a decade of experience where I've been kind of like tweaking this along the way to figure out what helps people be most successful. So I created a four-step system, which I call the Energy MD method. And the first step is to figure out the causes that individuals have. Now, if you're at the place of chronic fatigue syndrome, long COVID, or really bad chronic fatigue, and I should divert for a second. The difference between chronic fatigue and chronic fatigue syndrome isn't much. Chronic fatigue syndrome is an actual diagnosis that is put forth by the CDC that I don't necessarily agree with. But the reality is that if you have really bad exhaustion, if you exert yourself and you feel worse, potentially you have sleep issues, you have body pain, you have brain fog. You don't have to have all those things, but the reality is that if you're having some of these symptoms, there's a problem with your body and you need help. And the causes are all going to be the same, whether we're talking about chronic fatigue syndrome, or long COVID, except with long COVID, you've got the spike protein on top of everything else. So the first step in this process is to figure out the causes you have. Everybody that I see has the toxic five. So once again, that's a combination of heavy metals, chemicals, molds, infections, including the spike protein with long COVID, and nervous system dysfunction. They also have adrenal gland dysfunction, which is responsible for managing stress in the body. We talked about how all these are stressors, mental, emotional, and physical stressors. And then they all have mitochondrial dysfunction, which the mitochondria is found in every cell in the body except for red blood cells, and it makes 70 to 90% of our energy. So if we're having energy issues, we're going to have mitochondrial dysfunction. So I already know that those are going to be some of the causes. There's another 20 some odd causes that we look at to determine which people have. But that's the first thing that you do is figure out the causes that you have. Because if you don't know that, it's kind of like having a map and not knowing where you're going. If I want to
Mhm,
drive to you in Alaska, I gotta know where you are, where I am, and how to get there, right? And so
mhm,
if I'm just gonna if I just get in my car and just start driving, I'm not gonna be able to get there, right? So you have to have that
mhm,
map. So
mhm,
that's the first step. And then when we look at these different causes, we have to kind of look, I compartmentalize them into deficiencies and toxicities. And the deficiencies are things like the hormones, vitamins, minerals, mitochondria, lifestyle habits. Toxicities are the toxic five that I referred to before. And so we need to then go through a process of replacing the deficiencies, removing the toxicities, and also we want to open up the detox pathways to make sure that the toxins have a place to go so that they can get out of the body when you go through this process. Otherwise, you just feel worse through it. So once we identify what causes you have, and this is one way that we personalize things when people come into our world, you go through a curriculum where you fill out a form. I evaluate that form. I provide you with a personalized plan that's in the form of a Google Sheet for the most part with some additional notes. And then I tell you the supplements that you need to work through this process. We make a change every 4 days so that we can see what's happening. You're able to document your symptom changes as we're adding in these supplements to address all the causes that you have. Essentially, it's kind of like a supplement for every cause. There's also the nervous system retraining practices that we have, because that's incredibly important, that we can talk about more in just a little bit. But it's really, to simplify this, it's really what causes do you have? What are the solutions to each of those causes? And then what kind of availability or access do you have to get support along the way? So
mm,
once you have your plan, you start implementing the supplements. And then whenever you have a question, you reach out. And we have an online community of like-minded people who are all going through the same process. I guarantee a response to any question that people have in 2 business days. So I answer questions Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays in order to be able to do that, because pivoting is probably the most important part of this process. When you feel worse, you have a question, it's really important that you reach out, you get an answer to that question so you can pivot and you can keep going. And then
mm,
that's kind of how the process works. There's one-on-ones included, there's group calls, there's SOS calls. So there's a lot of support to make sure that you get what you need along the way. And the expectation that I have for folks, I say the magic usually happens somewhere between month 6 and month 9, typically around month 9, when you've gotten rid of a number of the toxic 5, and all of a sudden the body turns back on and can start producing its own energy, and that everybody takes at least 12 months. So having that sort of expectation also really helps people understand. And, part of the reason why I created this too, and why I don't do that much testing, which we can talk about more in a minute why I do that, is that I want to make sure that we address every single cause that an individual has, not just those that are found on laboratory tests, since laboratory tests are imperfect. So I want to make sure at the end of the 12 months, or even if it takes longer than that, that we've left no stone unturned. I don't want to be at 12 months and be like, gosh, I wish we addressed mold or heavy metals or chemicals or this particular infection or that particular infection or the nervous system retraining, right? We want to address it all so that once people are done with this program, they've got their life to live, and it's smooth sailing after that.
So cool. I've always had a ton of admiration for your program. It's neat for me today hearing where it's evolved to. And I think that's part of what's really cool about getting to hang out with my tribe when I do the podcast, since I'm in rural Alaska. Thursdays are when I get to be with my tribe. And it's nice sometimes when years have gone by, because then the evolution is remarkable. I want to flag two things as we go into these next topics. One is that in, let's see, 18 years of functional medicine, I used to have these sort of timid starts with plans. And the bummer there was that people would blow out of orbit before we had a chance to make a difference. And then I started treating more assertively when I saw people at that moment in their case where they came back. As an aside, always in my practice, they've passed the inflection point, the system's turned on. When their skin gets flat, the puffiness goes away, the color comes back, and their eyes get bright. That trifecta is the moment in my practice that the system is rebooting, and they're invariably sort of gushy. If they're sentimental people at all, they're saying, yay, it's finally worked. But now I talk to people about these assertive plans where we're really creating a set of conditions where the system can boot up and not being timid. That's what I'm hearing today. This is a very assertive way to work that creates optimal conditions to boot up. Secondly, I think it'll be super important for people to hear about the nervous system retraining, because I think this is one of the most poorly understood, and it's talked about, but I don't think it can be talked about enough, because I don't think people know that the nervous system sort of keeps defaulting and looping until it's reset, even if conditions become more favorable. Do you think that's accurate?
I do. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that the nervous system dysfunction piece is more important than people realize, and that you really can't achieve complete resolution of your chronic fatigue syndrome and your long COVID unless you're doing that work. It's that important, and it's why we've included it now as part of our program.
Mhm.
And so I tell people that we don't know whether nervous system dysfunction is 10% of your issue or 90% of your issue. I've had people who go whole hog after nervous system retraining and they're better in 6 months, and
Mhm.
other people who kind of, and you have to do it in concert with the other toxic four, but the reality is that it's just an incredibly important part of this. And I didn't realize that until a couple of years ago. And then just the last 6 months, we've included it as part of our program. So we're getting more and more into that and having more conversations about that. It's the mindset work, it's the somatic work, working on things in the body to help retrain the nervous system. So there's a number of different components, number of different ways that we kind of come at it in order to be able to work on improving the nervous system. Because as the nervous system goes, so goes the immune system, so goes all these other aspects. So it really has to be collaborative.
Mm. Yeah, that's just the best. And we could go on for days about the number of cases I've seen and the degree to which you see in your practice. When folks engage that, then it's sort of like watering the garden or amending the soil. It creates these necessary conditions for everything else to happen. I do wonder if folks in Western industrialized societies kind of start from behind on this one, because if you and I were raised in Tibet, we might have a pretty sort of common sense thought that restorative practice, meditation, mindfulness, having our nervous system be very chill despite adversity is just a desirable and necessary thing, like eating and having clothing. But I worry that we've sort of outthought ourselves in the United States, and and we don't come to this as quickly. I'm always invoking Herb Benson and his work from Harvard because it just sort of in my practice it gets people's attention that we're turning the genes that are part of the stuckness off, and we're turning the rest and restore, rest and digest genes on via these autonomic resets. And so the watershed benefits sort of can't be overstated.
Yeah, I think it's really that you did a nice job mentioning, that we're outthinking ourselves essentially. And I think part of the problem is we're so focused on the intellectual and
Mhm.
not on the somatic or the relational. Like we don't have relationships with ourselves as in terms of like our bodies. And it's more about like what can you achieve intellectually instead of having this relationship with ourselves. Like what do we when we look around and we consider people successful, it's not like, oh, that person over there has a really amazing relationship with themselves. So and that really is, I think, the goal in terms of healing. It becomes
Mhm.
very much a spiritual path for people who let it. When, we're being informed, by our illness, there are things that we need to work on. And so consequently, if we take that guidance and we change for the better and we grow and we develop this relationship with ourselves and this understanding, great things are possible.
Mm, terrific. I should, for purposes of disclosure, I should sort of reiterate to the audience, I had my own inflection point of being sick and tired. It was here in Homer. I was admitting patients to the hospital for a local clinic. It was about 11 to 12 years ago. And there's just this moment where it was 3 in the morning, and the person whose stroke I had managed, I heard the chopper blades whirring off into the Alaskan night to head up to Anchorage. And I thought there are people that can do this their whole career, but I can't. I I'm so passionate about functional medicine that I do in my outpatient practice during the day, and then I'm just getting too tired and depleted, and my body's not happy, and I'm not healthy. And fast forward, the amount of productivity I have now, the actual ability to achieve a bunch of the things those of us in Western industrialized societies are really interested in, is that just a fraction of the perceived effort. And it's sort of this cup that's spilling over. And so I love it that we don't have to choose if we go all in on sort of our birthright, vibrant health in alignment with our physiology and our mental, emotional, spiritual health. Uh, we sort of get to have a lot of everything we want. I don't know if that's overblown, but that's been kind of my experience.
Yeah, I think as we go, so goes the rest of our lives. So go our relationships. The more work that we do on ourselves, the better our relationships are, the better our work is, our career, all of it. So yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And that's not really, I think it might be a leap for a lot of people who are kind of listening to this to kind of understand that, and it is the long game. It is
Hmm.
that work that kind of that you don't see the benefits right away, potentially. You don't practice meditation and mindfulness and nervous system retraining to get good at those things. You practice them to get good at life, but it does take some time.
Mm. Well, let's use that as a segue as well. So I love the honesty and transparency and integrity of saying, hey, if you try this program, just know you're going to need to do this for a while, and just know that up front. And that's really if we were starting to play the guitar or the piano or sing or try to start running and we hadn't run. I mean, these are, or take on new responsibilities at work and get trained for it. So I think that that's just a terrific way to have folks mentally prepare. Okay, I'm going to make an investment, and also feel a sense of confidence. This 1 year investment has a very high likelihood of the beginning of definitive resolution of what's an intractable problem for most of the people that we see. And it mirrors a bunch of the other big thought leaders. I also love it about functional medicine that the most important ideas, I think of them as co-emergence of the same truth in multiple domains. These same really important ideas keep surfacing everywhere. And so Tom Salt talks about 3% definitive resolution in a month, which is, 36% definitive resolution in a year, which is about 3 years. Another expert talks about 1 month to get better for every year you've been ill, whatever that means to you. And then the functional medicine research clinic in Gig Harbor, when Dr. Bland was running that, and those folks, they would say, don't make any decisions about the efficacy of your plan until the first week of month 4. So this emerges again and again and again. Make an investment, wait, be patient. And I just think it's really good for people to know, probably because they're used to their blood pressure drug kicking in immediately. Their systolic's going to drop 10 points or it's not.
Right.
And I think what you and I are doing is we're leveraging that the body knows the way. We're providing the conditions for optimization, and then really good things happen. So, A, any thoughts on that? And B, what more do people need to know that we haven't talked about yet?
Yeah, I think that, when you talked about, making the investment of time, energy, money, like and understanding the expectation that it's going to take a while, the way that I explain it to people is it's basically a master's degree in your health. It's going to take a year or more, but there is an ROI. There's a return on your investment because you get your life back, right? It's kind of like when we did residency. I strongly considered not doing residency because I knew that I wanted to practice integrative medicine. It was kind of a little bit before functional medicine. I didn't really know about functional medicine when I graduated medical school back in 2000 or 2003. And so I was strongly considering not going to residency, but I knew it was going to give me something. I was going to get full, and I actually was going to go into psychiatry, but I decided that I wanted to do family medicine because I wanted to have that full understanding of the human experience and human health. Deliver babies, everything from birth to earth, so that I could help everybody. Plus, I wanted to do acupuncture and yoga therapy and all this sort of thing. So I needed to be able to touch people, which I couldn't really do in psychiatry. And so I made that decision to do that because I knew that it was going to give me something afterwards, right? It was an investment of my time, energy, and money. And so many things in life, if you look at them, is that it becomes easier to make that investment. Unfortunately, a lot of people, are willing to make a $25,000, $40,000 or more investment in a car, but not, five or $10,000 in their health. You know what I mean? So it
Hmm.
does, I think it's really important for people kind of change the way they look at it, in order to kind of get perspective from that. And I think the other thing that you were talking about really is this overall burden. It's the question of, how long does it take to for the body to make these changes? And I think that, I guess it was Atlas who's kind of like holding up the world on his back, right?
Hmm.
I see that as like the toxic five. It really is this burden. And the
Hmm.
more that you can relieve that burden, the more that you can, the faster you get better. And so I think one of the things when choosing a practitioner is is having this focus on the causes. Because sometimes when I see people, they say, I was seeing this practitioner and they were just kind of shotgunning things. Let's try this, let's try this, let's try this. And I think it's really important for them to work collaboratively with their practitioner to make sure that they're addressing causes, whether it's deficiencies, whether it's toxicities. And I tell people if you're not having success addressing deficiencies, well, first off, if you're not having success addressing lifestyle habits and you do those and you still don't feel well, then you go to replacing the deficiencies. And if you still don't feel well, then you have to go to addressing the toxic five. And if you don't have movement, like you're not noticing a benefit in your, at least in long COVID or chronic fatigue syndrome or chronic fatigue in a year, and you don't have a plan, like there's not a four-step process or you don't know what causes you're addressing, then it's time to change to another practitioner. I don't know
Hmm.
what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up because it's come up recently in a number of my podcast interviews that people do ask, well, who should I see? How should I think about this? Should I trust and stick with it? Should I make a change? And I think at the end of the day, it's kind of maybe in some ways it's like one's car mechanic. After all of us have been through the experience of somebody making 4 changes to the vehicle and a lot of bills, and the problem is still there. And
Right.
then that same feeling of then when we work with somebody who really knows what they're doing and they get more done with less, or they tell us, hey, sorry, but you need a new transmission. I'm really good at this. And that's the deal. This isn't your carburetor, it's not the chip. I just think that I think people are frustrated, stressed, afraid, and what they feel legitimately is a fractured and siloed system. And so they need to know, thankfully, we are into the new day. There are many very reputable resources. I would say I am a little cranky about some of the resources out there that I don't think are optimal. I think the folks providing the resources are well intentioned, but I think it's really hard to get this right. I think it takes a lot of devotion. And I think it even takes having a community of providers who are really holding one another to a very high standard about who they trust. And so I'm sort of perceiving all of this as these safe harbors within this sort of sea of chaos. And part of what I take really serious about the podcast is that it is a chance then for people who uh, trust my voice for better or worse, to find other trustworthy voices. But yeah, very long-winded answer to listen to your heart, your head, and your gut. And if it's telling you something else could be better and you're not getting what you want, you need to move on. Because we've just got, in my medical school and residency, I was taught that the brain's a computer, the nerves are wires, the gut's plumbing, we're a machine. And we're much more like ecosystems in nature. All of us is interrelating with all the rest of us. And pretty much people have to have some sort of functional, integrative, holistic, contemporary understanding of what's going on to get better. Because 80% of the stuff that's addressed by the healthcare system doesn't respond to one-to-one bug to drug fixes or pills or procedures. So they need somebody like you or me. That's my bias.
Agreed. Yeah.
Well, what didn't we get to talk about that's important? Because again, the cool thing is if people think, oh, I need this guy, they can go to the show notes, they can go to your program, they can do that work. But what might light them up to know today that we didn't get to drill into?
Well, I think talking about the challenges with laboratory testing is really interesting. I've been doing this work with chronic fatigue syndrome and chronic fatigue for the last decade, and then long COVID the last couple of years. And I used to do a lot of testing, blood testing, urine testing, to look at all the toxins and to look at all of the deficiencies. And really, what I found is that 90% of these can be determined by symptoms. And you can't really get to chronic fatigue syndrome and long COVID if you don't have the toxic five. And so I don't even test for heavy metals, chemicals, molds, and infections anymore. I treat them all because at the end of the 12 months, I don't want to have missed anything because I've done that before. You know,
Mhm.
I've, I would test for everything and certain things wouldn't show up and I would say, great, we don't have to deal with this thing or the other thing. And then they're not better in 12 months. And what I found is that when I started treating everything, that people got better, you know? So it's kind of like the testing is imperfect for a number of reasons. If we're looking at the immune system's reaction to an infection to determine if an infection is there, it counts on the immune system being intact and functional. But when you have the toxic five, the immune system is not intact or functional. So consequently, you're asking a dysfunctional immune system to give you an accurate test. When we're
Mhm.
looking at the urine testing for heavy metals, chemicals, molds, and even with infections, those tests are really tests of excretion. So they tell us how well you're excreting. So when somebody would initially come into my world and we would do that testing, they wouldn't test for a lot of things. They wouldn't be excreting a lot. But then 6 months into the program, if we test it again, all of a sudden there's a waterfall of a lot of these toxins. And part of
Mhm.
that also has to do with the fact that there's a toxic matrix for the toxic five where they're all bound up together. And as you pull one thing out, other things come out as well. And so just because you're testing for it and you're not seeing it doesn't mean that it's not there and that it still needs to be treated. So yeah, I think that's really important because so many practitioners, when I lecture to other physicians, I tell them if you lean too heavy on your labs, you will fall over. right? They're just imperfect. And we really like data as humans, so people have a
Hmm.
hard time accepting that. But I tell them, I say, what haven't you addressed? I'm always looking for like what's missing. Like
Hmm.
if you haven't addressed it, if you're still sick, then you haven't addressed something. And what I
Hmm.
found is that I've never met anybody who has addressed the toxic five completely and haven't gotten better,
Hmm. Yeah.
So I think that that's really telling. And so I think that's kind of like an important part of this picture.
Mm. So cool. Yeah, it's so cool to me that when the thought leaders go all in, then there's this pattern recognition that kicks in. I do wonder if part of it, some of that stuff that Malcolm Gladwell talks about in his book Blink, where that 10,000 hour mark of doing things, then there's these sort of gestalt understandings that start kicking in that are very rapid, sort of clear-eyed ways via pattern recognition of saying, oh, well, here's the deficiencies in the tests. Some of it is mirrored in our first rotations in third year med school when we're taught to treat the patient, not the lab results. So there are other iterations of this same idea, but it becomes radical when we say, just go ahead and boot up all the systems. I also would say it probably requires somebody extremely well and rigorously trained like you to be able to utilize the historical findings in what I would characterize as a brilliant way to pull the whole thing together. And so I don't think this sort of thing is possible unless it's in the hands of a really gifted practitioner. So I want to acknowledge that.
It's very kind.
Well, oh yeah, thank you. Well, I think this is a good place to kind of pull it together. How can people find you?
So I'm at energymdmethod.com. And if you go there, you can kind of learn all about like how we're different. We have a new master class that kind of goes into depth on the four-step process. My philosophy, if you go through that and you feel like you want to see if we're a good fit to work together, you can get on a free call with me where we'll kind of dive in and see if we are a good fit. If we're not, no worries. If we are, you can join and experience kind of like what we talked about today. But that's the best place to find me.
Well, Dr. Evan, because I do feel so much for all of these folks that I see and know about whose energy's not right and they know they can do better. Thank you for the work you do and your devotion and all the light you bring. And hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for having me on, Rob.
Thanks for joining us for the Seaworthy podcast. Seaworthy exists to help people overcome their health challenges and be fully vital. If you think we've earned it, please consider giving this podcast a like, subscribing, and giving us a 5-star rating on the platform of your choice. Thanks.